here in the Charlotte office of Moore & Allen, and we're pleased to welcome you to the second to last in our series of privacy and data security seminars that we've been putting on in the last year. Today we're going to focus on PCI standards for the healthcare industry, and we have we have a very distinguished guest, Dr. Suzanne Miller of Vaco Risk Solutions, who is a nationally recognized expert in PCI and HIPAA compliance, so we're very pleased to have her with us today. And as well, we have Todd Taylor, who is co-chair of our privacy and data security practice here at the firm. And that is a conglomeration of intellectual property team and healthcare team and a variety of other folks that have come together to form our privacy and data security team. And so in addition to Todd, we have Kimberly Kirk, who's with us today as part of that team. So we're going to go ahead and get started so we can get you out to your workday. But Todd,
sure.
Do you want to get started?
Sure. Thank you very much, Carol. And thank you all for joining us today. Just, the bad news is there are going to be yet some more acronyms that we have to deal with. The good news is that you're dealing with HIPAA and high tech. You're used to acronyms, so here's some more. So we're going to talk a little bit today about PCI DSS, and that stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means for your companies as a legal and a contractual matter, and what the implications are from a legal standpoint if you don't comply with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. And then Dr. Miller is going to spend a little bit of time talking about its interaction with HIPAA and high tech, and then also some of the more operational issues and compliance issues that you have to deal with under PCI DSS. My part of the presentation is going to go fairly quickly, but I do think it's worthwhile to know what this means legally for you. So, as a starting point, and these materials are all in your handouts, I wanted to talk a little bit about why PCI DSS matters, and to understand that, you probably need to understand the growth in electronic payments that are handled through credit cards and debit cards and any kind of, frankly, payment card. It is tremendously grown in the really in the last 15 and 20 years. And you'll see in 2012, this was according to a study done by the Federal Reserve back in 2013. They looked back over the past decade about the growth of payment card transactions. In 2012, there were approximately 82 billion payment transactions undertaken in the U.S. through the use of any kind of payment card. It could be a credit card, it could be a debit card, it could be some kind of prepaid card. If you look back in 2003, payment cards accounted for 43% of all non-cash payments, whereas in 2012 it was 67% of all non-cash payments. That's going to continue to grow. Cash is, there have been a number of financial regulations that have been passed over the last really almost 10 years now that have been directed to taking checks out of the financial system and taking paper out of the financial system. I used to work for a bank. It is tremendously expensive to transport cash from a retail location, put it into a truck, and transfer it to a vault. Payment card transactions are much less expensive to process, at least in terms of physical movement. However, with the rise of payment cards, there's also been a corresponding growth in security breaches. I just pulled some data. For instance, just a number of states actually come out with their own sort of data security reports. Massachusetts comes out with a report, California comes out with a report, and they sort of analyze what kinds of data breaches have been reported to their state authorities, state attorney generals, or in this case, the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation of Massachusetts. And in 2013, they indicated that 76% of the reported data breaches involved credit or debit card account information. So you can see that there is a fair number of transactions that are actually getting exposed or taken advantage of. I'm sure many of you have heard about some of the prominent breaches. Two of the more recent ones, obviously within the last year, have involved Target and Home Depot, where criminal gangs actually were able to insert malware through various points into Target's systems and then Home Depot systems as well. And typically what happens is the organized criminal actors who are taking this information, they'll introduce the malware into the system, they steal it, and then they actually will sell this on websites where criminal organizations can go and obtain it. So it may help to in understanding the payment card rules. It may help to understand the how a payment transaction works. And so I've drawn a little diagram here, and this is a very, very basic diagram. It's actually a little more complicated than this, and there are some other players that will typically get involved in the transactions here. But this gives you a fairly good idea. So it starts with a customer who has a payment card, a debit card, credit card, going to the merchant. Could be a medical practice, could be a hospital, could be any merchant that accepts a payment card. Transaction will be swiped at the point of sale. The information is then captured and transferred through an entity called the Merchant Acquiring Bank or the Merchant Acquiring Company. There are some other companies that can get involved in this process too, but for our purposes, I'll keep it simple and we'll just say the Merchant Acquiring Bank. That entity is actually responsible for setting up the systems that will take in the payment at the merchant location and transmit it through to the card associations. These are the branded networks that each have their own proprietary payment rails or their payment systems. And this, typically the big ones we think of are MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and Visa. There's another one that we'll talk about in a few minutes called JCB. There's some other players out there too, but in terms of the PCI data security standards, these are the four main ones, and JCB is another member of that as well. And then there is the issuing bank. The issuing bank is the person that gives you your credit card as the customer. Could be Bank of America, could be Wells Fargo, could be First Citizens, could be any number of banks that will issue a card with their logo and then with the, the branded card association's logo on it. And Discover and American Express are not issued directly through banks like Bank of America, First Union, but the MasterCard and Visa ones are. And then the issuing bank says, yep, that transaction can happen. They flow the money back down through the system, and all along the way, fees are being collected, interchange fees are being collected by these various players over here, and then the money eventually routes back to the merchant after the transaction's been approved. This all happens very, very quickly, within milliseconds. And ultimately, the customer gets a bill from the issuing bank and pays the transaction. So you can see there are a number of places, a number of players in this process, and there are a number of places where information can be swiped as we go through it. So let's talk about PCI DSS just for a minute. It was originally adopted in 2004, the first version of the payment card industry data security standard. The founding members of the PCI Security Standards Council are Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and Japan Credit Bureau. They have administrative responsibility over PCI DSS. The new PCI DSS 3.0 became effective on January 1, 2014. It's in a phase-in period right now. Dr. Miller will talk a little bit more about how that phase-in is working and what the ultimate transition date is going to be, which is coming up on us. PCI DSS basically sets forth minimum technical and operational requirements for protection of cardholder data. It's a baseline. You can have higher standards if you want to, but at a minimum you have to, if you're processing, transmitting, storing, maintaining credit card data, you have to comply with PCI DSS rules. It applies to anybody involved in payment card processing. So if you think, gee, I've just got a small medical practice, I do have a little machine where I swipe credit cards, but yeah, I'm small. It doesn't matter. I don't have to comply with PCI DSS. That's not true. Everybody has to comply. There are 12 basic rules as part of PCI DSS. I'm not going to sort of go through all of those right now. These are the very high-level rules. There's sub-requirements under each of these rules and standards, but this gives you a basic idea of the type of, frankly, common sense security measures that you would think to take when you're taking in, storing, or transmitting credit card information. How is PCI DSS enforced? It's not a statute, it's not a regulation, it's enforced through contract. The card associations each have their own operating rules, and they're voluminous. I have copies of these in my office. The Visa rules alone are, I think, over 1,200 pages. They're huge. They're hard to understand. I'm a lawyer who reads contracts every day. I don't understand half the things I read in the Visa rules. They're not transparent, but they're voluminous. They're there, and the operating rules basically say, hey, if you're a member of my card association, and that members are typically the issuing banks that issue the credit cards, or the merchant acquiring institutions, the banks that process the payment transactions, they're the members. In turn, the merchant acquirers, when they come to a merchant and say, hey, let me process your credit card transactions for you, they will have you sign an agreement called a merchant acquiring agreement or payment card transaction agreement. And that agreement will say, as a condition for me processing your cards, you have to agree to abide by all the operating rules, the card associations, and other associated rules such as the PCI DSS standard. If you fail to comply with those, I can impose fines. And if the card associations impose fines on me, you have to indemnify me for any losses that I, as your card processor, take when Visa or MasterCard come after me. And again, so the merchants are bound through their processing agreements. Each of the individual card brands have established... Yes. Yes.
I had a question.
Yes.
So what do you hear in terms of how fines are publicized, or do you hear anything about fines at all from the merchants?
That's a great question, and Dr. Miller can weigh in as well. If you read the operating rules actually basically say, hey, merchant, or hey, merchant acquirer, I'm going to impose the fines on you. Mm-hmm. How you collect those fines and where you get reimbursed from those fines is your business. But it's your job. You're responsible for your merchant's behavior. I'm collecting the fine on you. And in fact, you can't tell the merchant that if you go and find them that Visa or MasterCard is making you impose that fine on them. So there is a little bit of a lack of transparency. I have seen on the web various sort of standards of what the fine amounts are for each of the different card associations, but I don't know if there's, I've not actually seen any formal pronouncements, and Dr. Miller, you may have, where Visa or MasterCard will say what their scheduled fine list is, but it's not that transparent. They have a lot of discretion in how they can impose those fines, and the fines do not have to relate to the actual damages that are incurred by the card associations or any issuing banks in connection with the data breach. So, and I'll talk in just a minute about some cases out there that are challenging these rules, but typically what will happen is Visa may say, okay, we found there was a data breach, we found that there was some exposure, we're imposing a fine of $5,000 a month or $10,000 a month or whatever it is until the problem is cured on you, merchant acquirer. And then the merchant acquirer turns around and says to the merchant, gee, you have this indemnity agreement with me, you have to pay back everything I owe to the card association.
So even though these are not publicized, you are coming across intelligence that tells you it's
I had a client
out for that type of failure.
Well, I wouldn't even say, I would see it at, I would say it varies. My sense is that it is a revenue source for the card associations, and there is not a lot of sort of firm understanding of how the fine actually ties to the actual losses. Because if you think about how the whole card process works, when there is a breach of credit card data, the individual consumer themselves really doesn't suffer any losses. By law in the US, you're limited to about, and most banks now even waive this, you're limited to $50 of losses essentially once there's been a breach, and again, most banks waive that now. So the individual, you and me, really aren't affected. The people that are affected in the process is not the card brands, it's the card issuer. The card issuer has to reissue credit cards for all the breaches, and that's where the cost is. And so, there may be ways for the issuer to come back to the card associations and work out some kind of compensation for that. But the brand itself, it's just, frankly, a policeman over the entire process. And again, in terms of direct damages, as a legal matter, they probably have a hard time proving direct damages. I will say, and Dr. Miller may talk about this in her presentation, there are different merchant levels that each of the card associations assign, and there are different compliance monitoring requirements depending on the number of transactions that you process, and also depending on whether you've had past violations or not. Generally, level 1 merchants are subject to higher levels of audit and reporting standards. Level 4 merchants are generally subject to less, and again, each of the card associations are going to have different sort of sub-rules. Frankly, one of the biggest penalties is not just the fines, but frankly, you could lose your ability to have card payments transacted, and that would kill a business. At least 2 merchants are challenging the imposition of fines for PCI DSS violations. I'm just going to real quick talk about the Genesco case. This is a very recent one. So Genesco, which is a retailer of clothing and footwear products, they had an alleged breach involving cyber attackers that infiltrated their systems. They were using Wells Fargo and Fifth Third Bank to do their payment processing. Wells Fargo was doing credit card and non-PIN-based debit card transactions, and Fifth Third was doing the PIN-based debit card transactions for Genesco. The breach occurred. Visa and the banks did some investigation. Visa said, okay, Wells Fargo, Fifth Third, you owe me $13 million in fines. Simplifying a little bit here, but that's basically what happened. Wells Fargo and Fifth Third turned around to Genesco and said, gee, I owe Visa, so you have to indemnify me. And so Genesco paid up. Genesco actually had to set up a reserve account too, and the banks were able to directly take some of that money from Genesco as well. Genesco then turned around and sued Visa, and basically saying, look, A, there wasn't a breach, and B, it's an unfair and deceptive trade practice because there really is no transparency around these card rules and what I violated and how the fines are imposed. And in addition, your fine acts as a penalty. It doesn't tie to the real damages. And there's this concept under common law contract theory that basically when you impose fines under contract, it has to be for damages. It has to tie to some actual harm that has been suffered. You can't impose a penalty that doesn't tie to actual damage. And so the theory Genesco is operating on is under the amount of money that you sought to collect from me has no real world tie to the actual damages. There has not been a formal ruling on this case. Visa made a motion to dismiss the claims made by Genesco, and the federal court just recently ruled, no, sorry, this case can proceed against Visa. So we'll remain to see what an actual court ruling is on this. There's another case involving, it's a very small one location restaurant in Utah. It's they're a pizza restaurant. They had a alleged data breach, and their merchant acquirer imposed, I think, $82,000 in fines on them. And they were frankly not happy about that. They had brought in their own auditor who said there never had really been an exposure of data. They sued, and again, they sued under very similar theories as to what Genesco did. They actually sued their merchant acquirer directly. Again, there's been no ruling on this case, but there may yet be some pushback from a legal matter depending on how those cases go and whether you can actually collect some of the fines the card associates have been attempting to collect. The last thing I wanted to mention real quickly, there are state laws out there that have attempted to address PCI data security standards in their state legislation. These are the 3 states that I think right now have laws that basically tie into credit card data. The state of Washington has essentially a safe harbor that says they're exempt from doing some of the data breach notifications regarding cardholder data if they've been certified as compliant with PCI standards. Minnesota has essentially written into their statute, their Plastic Card Security Act statute, some of the PCI requirements, such as they can't retain certain of the data taken from the mag stripe on the card for more than 48 hours after authorization. And then Nevada actually requires business entities accessing payment cards to comply with PCI DSS. So they've actually made it a part of their statute. So if you're in Nevada and you violate PCI, not only you're contractually liable, you're statutorily liable as well. That's basically it from a legal standpoint. I'll let Dr. Miller talk a little bit more about the interaction with this and some of the HIPAA and high-tech rules you're living with now, and then some of the more practical aspects of PCI.
Can I ask you a question before
Sure.
you transition? How will chip and pin technology affect all of this? Because I don't think it's going to be part of it.
I'll actually let Dr. Miller address that. From a legal standpoint, in theory, all the rules will remain the same, but you're right, the mag stripe is a much less secure form of technology, and frankly, it's pretty easy to get a skimmer to skim all the information off a mag card, and so in theory, the chip and pin will avoid that. I will tell you, having come out of the banking industry, the reason that has not been adopted in the U.S. or not widely adopted in the U.S. like you see in Europe and Japan, there is a real issue about who pays for sort of rejiggering all the systems, because the front end, getting all the sort of machines changed out from being mag stripe machines to being chip and pin based machines, it's an expensive process, and that sort of slowed us up in the U.S. Dr. Miller, I don't know if you have anything you could add to that.
The chip and pin is a technology that only encrypts the pin, does not encrypt the data. So Europe has it, but yet the data is not encrypted. there's a falsehood for people to think that that's the end-all, do-all. And in the United States, they're trying to call it the dip and pin rather than the chip and pin, which is kind of interesting because we have to do things differently. There's some things about technology, we'll talk about them when we get to them, but realize the new cards that are coming out are still going to have the mag stripe on them. So you still have that vulnerability that exists. So
we have the other person.
It's behind them.
Okay.
where am I hiding? And as we get to some of this information, we'll look at that a little deeper. I'm with Vaco Risk Solutions, and we're a qualified security assessor. And we're in 30 locations around the United States. We were the 15th QSA. And that's it. Next one. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are two things. First of all, we're going to talk about HIPAA, high tech, and its relationship to PCI. The next thing we're going to talk about is PCI. So the reason why we're going to do this first is because, as you know, HIPAA is a federal regulation. And we all know that it's existed for a very, very long time. But it's important for us to go back and to review what we know about individually identifiable health information. And it's health information created and received by a healthcare provider, health plan, health clearinghouse, or business associate, thank you, high tech, which relates to a person's physical, mental health, or provisions of health care to that person, or to the, and it is in blue, or to the payment of that person's health care. Taking a credit card is taking a payment for health care services. So when you talk about PCI, it's actually a subset of HIPAA. And common terms for PCI, as you know, for individually identifiable health information is PHI, EPHI, and some people call it protected health information, and some people call it personal health information. But it's individually identifiable health information and includes payment. So when we talk about HIPAA, and I'm going to focus only on the PCI side as it relates to PHI, we are talking about the privacy and security rules, because they say you need to protect it, and you need to protect it and secure it, whether it is transmitted or whether it's stored in any form. What is any form? Voice, paper, and electronic. So when you talk about voice, you have a call center that takes credit cards over the phone, those voice recordings. When you talk about paper, you guys are the paper dinosaurs, so you know what I mean when I talk about paper. You even used to years ago write it on the file somewhere, the credit card number. So you got it all over the place. Electronic, what is electronic data? Well, electronic data is anything that's stored electronically, whether you take it on your iPhone, whether you take it on the computer, whether you go someplace else and put it in. So you have to protect payment data underneath HIPAA, which is credit card data that's in any one of those forms. Let's look at the security rule. This comes straight from the regulations. You have three pieces to HIPAA's security rule. You have administrative, physical, and technical controls you have to have in place. You need administrative, physical, and technical controls around your payment card data that you are taking because it complies with HIPAA. So here you go. How many of you have never seen this before? Guess what? You're going to take it home with you. All right? It's important for you to look at this, and I'm not going to go into the minutiae of the detail of it, but everything you see here is exactly the 12 things that Todd just told you about. So when we talk about this, you've got to have a risk assessment done annually. PCI says the same thing. Talk about assigning a security responsibility. PCI says the same thing. Workforce security, meaning you have to have authorization and supervision to use those workforces. You have to have clearance procedures. PCI says you have to have background check. Information access management. Who accesses the data? How do they do it? So that's PCI. Security awareness training, that's PCI. Incident response, well, that's PCI as well. And then you've got contingency plan. PCI doesn't care if you lose your data. They're happy. So you don't have a contingency plan underneath PCI. All they care about is that you have it, you protect it. And if it gets destroyed, they're real happy with that. Evaluation, that's all over about PCI. The same thing's true with business associates. It's called service providers. Next one, physical control. Talk about physical controls. Your data center has to have certain controls around it that are stricter than HIPAA. Workstation use, you have to lock those workstations down underneath PCI. What you're seeing here is what the federal regulation tells you to do. They're telling you to have workstation use. And you're supposed to be able to put safeguards around that. What are those safeguards? PCI is very specific about what you need to do. So when you try to figure out how you're going to comply with HIPAA, you need to go look at PCI, and you need to do it to the strictest, because remember, payment information is still PHI. Device and media controls, how do you destroy it? PCI is very clear on how you destroy data. Technical controls, access controls, audit controls. PCI is real heavy on auditing. Every single device that's in scope for PCI, you gotta have those audit logs turned on, and you've gotta get them all to central server and monitor and look at what's going on to see if there's anything happening. Everything that you see about integrity and person authentication and transmission security, that's all PCI. So PCI is no different than what you should already be doing for HIPAA. Did you know that? All right, next one. Let's talk about high tech. High tech, as you all know, I think you do, came into effect in 2009, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. But the most important thing about this is that there's some changes that happen to HIPAA because of the fact that the government wants you to move toward electronic records. And so based upon that, they made some changes to it. And there are 9 changes that high tech brought into place, but we're only going to look at 4 of them, because those top 4 affect payment information that you as a healthcare are taking when you take credit cards. All right, so let's look at the first one. They expanded the responsibility of a business associate. Before high tech came out, there were 3 covered entities. Health plan, next one.
Clinical provider.
Healthcare provider, what's the last one?
Clearinghouse.
Clearinghouse. There were only 3, right? Today is a 4th one. The government brought your business associates into scope and said everyone who performs any type of a function or activity involving the use or disclosure of PHI must now comply with all the regulations. That came into effect. Guess what? PCI has already said that all along. Business associate agreements, you've got to work on those and make sure that you get them better than they were. Second thing that came into effect in high tech is breach notifications. And it's saying if you have a breach of PHI, which is payment information, if you have a breach, then you're obligated to notify each individual whose unsecured PHI has been or is reasonably believed to have been accessed, acquired, used, or disclosed as a result of a breach. Think about that. So a breach is that it's been accessed. And it's important in the PCI world to remember, if you have a breach, all it means is unauthorized access to data. That's it. Unauthorized access to data. Nobody said they used it to do a criminal act. Unauthorized access. The other thing you need to know about breach notification is there's some very strict things that high tech brought into place. And let's look at the last one. You have to notify everybody within 60 days, but you have to notify them what happened, the types of unsecured PHI that was exposed. What are the covered entities doing to investigate the breach, mitigate harm, protect against further breaches? And then what are the contact procedures for the individuals whose data was potentially breached, including a toll-free number, email address, website, or postal address? That's the information. Now the question is, if your data was breached today, would you know what was breached? Would you know? On the PCI side, if it was a credit card that was breached, the breach notification from the PCI Counsel is any data that was breached, you have to notify those people. So if you have a bunch of files in a back room and somebody comes into the middle of the night, breaks in, and files are all over the floor, and you had credit card and all of that, which ones do those people look at? Which ones do they take? I don't know. Well, guess what? Every file in that room now has to be notified because you didn't put proper controls in place to know what data is compromised at the time it is compromised. Think about that. So if you have a backup tape with data stored on it somewhere, and it's got credit card data on it, and they took it, every piece of credit card data, even if it's encrypted, has to be notified. That's why the cost of these breaches are so high. Once again, we're still on HIPAA. So the enforcement for all of the high-tech stuff, as you can tell, happened quite some time ago. But the very last thing for you to see here is that the Department of Health and Human Services must formally investigate complaints where primarily investigation indicates a violation of HIPAA. So not only are Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover and JCB going to come after you if you have a breach of credit card data, but healthcare provider, guess who else is coming after you if you have a breach of credit card data? And finally, High-Tech said, guess what? HIPAA violations are so cheap, everybody says, so sue me. So here's what they've done. Previously, the civil monetary penalties were limited to $100 per violation, not to exceed $25,000. High-Tech came into place, and let's just go all the way to the very end, $1 million, well over $1 million. So you're looking at if credit card data is breached, and you say you didn't know that you had to do that, each violation is anywhere between $100 up to $50,000, and within a year, $1.5 billion. Reasonable cause, willful neglect, and you corrected it, willful neglect and not corrected it. Willful neglect and not corrected it, I understand I'm supposed to do that, but I don't care. Any questions on HIPAA? All right, so let's move into PCI. Let me give you an overview of PCI. The council was formed. It's called the PCI Data Security Standards Council. And this was formed in September 7, 2008. And the goal here, because of all the breaches, these payment brands who did everything on their own decided to band together. And so they all came together to have an open global forum for the ongoing development, enhancement, storage, dissemination, implementation of security standards for account data protection. This doesn't say they penalize you. It says they're responsible for the development and the dissemination of that information. The council never fines you. They don't have anything to do with that. Their responsibility is to keep the standard and to train QSAs and ASVs, all those types of people that are out there doing your auditing as well as your scans. The council consists of American Express, Discover, Japanese card brand, MasterCard, Visa. There is discussion that Nacha one day is going to take these types of standards and implement them for your banking and your routing card information. That's to be seen. So I said this was called the PCI Data Security Standards Council. Actually, there's more than one. You've heard of PCI DSS, all right? But there's actually standards around payment devices. Michaels, classic company. Michaels has been breached twice. In 2010, Visa mandated, the council doesn't do that, the brands do, Visa mandated that everybody that takes a swipe on a terminal has to have terminals that were manufactured a certain way. So all the old terminals you need to get rid of and put these in. Michaels refused to do that. The old terminals are terminals that when you unplug them and then you take a rogue one, which means you've got one that looks just like it, but you put a USB in it and you put an antenna on it and you plugged it in such that every time there was a swipe, one for you and one for me out in the car lot, that's how they breached Michaels. Michaels refused to change this. And it's real simple to go online on eBay and buy these old devices here and configure them to work. So that's how they were breached the first time. Because Michaels refused to notify people in a timely fashion, the Department of Justice went after them for $1.5 million for not telling people they were breached timely, all right? So when you talk about the devices here, and by the way, Michaels still hasn't changed their devices. They were just breached again, I think, last year. But, so they're getting fined by Visa because they're not using the right devices, and they're getting fined by the Department of Justice because they're not notifying breaches timely. So you do have devices that are now being made that if you unplug it, it will not work when you plug it back in because you've got to reconfigure it. So we are manufacturing devices a certain way. Payment applications, the next one, PA DSS. Any payment application that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data must be PCI compliant. That means a QSA's got to go and review the code and make sure that it's written in a manner that meets that particular standards requirement. And you've got that in the healthcare arena, that you do have applications that have to be PA DSS certified. PCI DSS is you. How do you run your business? So now we have a whole infrastructure here, and on the very bottom one, devices that are point-to-point encryption. So today, we have devices, applications, infrastructure, and users. So we have 3 different types. And I will, at the end, tell you where to go find all that information. All right, so when we talk about PCI, who needs to comply? You need to understand that the payment brands have people that make the cards, and those people that make the cards give them to you as a customer. On the other side, the payment brands have acquirers. Those are people that sign up merchants that want to take payment cards for payments. Everyone in there has to comply with PCI. Every one of them except for the customer, okay? But we have another group over here called service providers. A service provider is anyone that affects the security of cardholder data. It's that simple. It's that simple. So if you are a merchant and you want to go after people that owe you money, so you hire a call center in India to call them, and they take the credit card numbers for you, they're your service provider. They have to comply as well. See how this relates back to HIPAA when they did that with the VAs? Right. Any questions on this?
I had a question on the Michael's DOJ.
Yes.
What's the basis for DOJ's finding? Is it Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission unfairness?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
See how well I did that?
Yeah, and just to let you know, the FTC is taking a much, much broader view of its authority under Section 5. If you've been following the Wyndham Hotel case, there was a federal court in New Jersey that just announced that, made a ruling that essentially allowed the FTC to pursue an unfair trade practice claim under Section 5 because of a breach of credit card data that was stored in reservation systems that Wyndham Hotels managed. And they basically said, your mere failure to have good security practices is an unfair practice. Traditionally, they had really focused on the deceptive component under Section 5. So now, failure to follow things like PCI in and of itself could be an unfair practice under Section 5.
So when we talk about service providers, and in HIPAA world, they're called business associates. It's a business directly involved in the processing, storing, transmitting of cardholder data on behalf of another entity, or that provides services to merchants, other service providers, and other entities which control or could impact the security. Data hosting centers are a very classic example of that. Someone who manages your firewall is a classic example of that, right? They have to be compliant. So when we talk about PCI, has to do with cardholder data. What is cardholder data? This is what you have to protect. This is what's the payment piece underneath HIPAA. What is it? Well, today, the PCI Security Standards Council is now calling it account data. It has 2 pieces to it. Cardholder data and sensitive authentication data. Cardholder data is the primary account number, the full 16 digits, unless you're American Express, because they have 15. Cardholder name, expiration date, service code. Sensitive authentication data is the full magnetic stripe. It also has the CVV2 code, that special code that you're supposed to give them, and then pins or pin blocks. So when we talk about cardholder data, we're talking about this side. We're not talking about that. You can never, ever, 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 ever store sensitive authentication data. That means you cannot write down the credit card number and the expiration date and write the CVV2 code on paper and keep that. You cannot do that. You cannot put that number in the computer system and retain that after settlement. You cannot do that. So let's go back to cardholder data. It all starts with the very first one, primary account number. If you are not capturing the full credit card number, you do not have cardholder data. It starts with that. Full 16 digits. If you put the full 16 digits in your system and it masks it, you still have full cardholder data. Mask means I'm not going to show you the full thing. That's what mask means. All right? If somebody says we redacted, what redacted means is that we have the full 16 digits, but you will never be able to read anything other than the last 4 or the first 6 or whatever. Redacted means you can never, ever read the full 16 digits. Sometimes you take it in and then the system systematically goes inside and in the middle puts X's all the way in it. And you'll never be able to get back to the full credit card number. So, do you have cardholder data? The first question you ask is, do we have full credit card numbers? If you have full credit card numbers, you have cardholder data. Now here's something else too. How many people are IT people? Okay, if you're an IT person and you're storing full credit card data, and you're storing in the same table with a name or an expiration date or a service code, all of those elements have to be encrypted, not just the credit card number. But if you store the account number over here, and then in another table you store the name and so forth, and you have pointers going back and forth, that's okay. You don't need to encrypt this over here, unless you're Massachusetts, then we have a whole other issue with person identifiable information. Do you understand that it all starts with the full credit card number? All right, next slide. So now let's talk about version 3 of the PCI Data Security Standard. How many of you didn't even know there was a version 1 and 2? All right, well the good news is you don't have to go back and figure out what those were. Version 3, this is the timeline for them, but what's important here is that on December 31st, 2014, when you validate that you're compliant, if you validate before 2014, you can still use version 2. If you validate after 2014, like January 1, 2015, you've got to validate underneath the new standard, which is version 3. And then there are some things in version 3 that are good to do, but by July the 1st, 2015, you have to do those. So there's a few of those, and we'll talk about those. All right? Any questions about the timeline? Okay. The key focus of version 3, what the council is trying to do is to get you to understand that security needs to be built into your business. It's not an event. Security is a process. You can't say, well, we're secure. No, you're really never secure. It's a process. So what they're telling you is that you need to constantly monitor your network and constantly test to make sure that all the security measures and processes are in place and functioning properly and kept up to date. It's important for you to get right here. These programs should scan all exchange data and all applications and all random access memory. What's happening now is that the bad guys are really good. You don't have stored data, and you tell me that all the time, I don't have stored data. It just sits in my memory. Well, guess what? The bad guys are really good at getting to your memory. So now memory has come in scope. Anything that's in random access memory, it's not stored, but it's just sitting there waiting. Yeah, you've got to store it. You've got to go through and scan that to make sure that that data is not being compromised. That's expensive. That's very expensive. When you looked at the PCI Data Security Standard, I know you all opened up that book and you looked at all those columns and you read all of them and you know them really, really well. Well, in 3.0, just like version 2, you're going to see the requirement, you're going to see the testing procedures. However, you're going to see a new column added, and that's guidance. Because PCI is very, very specific about what you need to do. Very specific. And you may say, we can't do that. We can't do that. However, if you read the intent, and you can do something that meets or exceeds the intent, then you can do that. Okay? And think about this. PCI applies to Delta Airlines. PCI applies to your organization, and PCI applies to the guy who cuts your grass. So when you look at the scope of everybody has to comply with this, you can understand why the council has finally said, what is the intent of this control, and are you meeting it based upon your level? All right? Let me give you some examples of some of the changes that have come down between version 2 and version 3, for you to understand it. And for those of you that have never really seen the minutiae of detail that you're required to do for PCI, because what I showed you in HIPAA, all those things, administrative, physical, and technical, that's all the regs say. You make up the rest as to how you do it. PCI, you don't make up the rest. They're telling you how to do it. So what happened in 3.0, we have a change here because in 2.0, they said, requirement 8, 5.7 said, provide authentication procedures and policies to your users. And what they're finding out is that the reason why you have to have this is because you want your people to truly understand what they need to do such that they don't put the company at risk. All right, so that's what they said. Now in 3.0, they decided you need more detail because this here is very basic and you're really not getting your people to understand because your weakest link is your untrained, unskilled employee. And 3.0, you have to include guidance for each one of those bullets. How do you select strong authentication credentials? You have to come up with procedures around that so your people understand what to do and you have to train them. When you have to provide policies and procedures to users, that means train them. Protecting authentication credentials, not reusing previous passwords, changing passwords as suspicious of compromise. So in 3.0, you have to do all that. And when you look at the bottom, changing passwords of suspicion of compromise, that's not good enough. You've got to train your people in specifically what does a compromised password look like. And that's over in section 12, all right? A little more minutia of detail here. Okay, and 2, we had 12.1.1, maintain a security policy that addresses all the requirements. And then develop daily operational procedures that are consistent with those. That's what it was in 2. And 3, they went, oh no, we're taking this out of here and we're putting it in every one of the 12 requirements. In requirement 1, they're now saying 1.5, security policies and operational procedures for managing firewalls, that they are documented and in use. Then they went to requirement 2 and they added this one in. Security policies and operational procedures for managing vendor defaults and security parameters are documented and in use. They did the same thing for 3, 4, 5, 6. So they took it out of this one generic statement.
What is a vendor default?
When you buy software, it comes to you with a username and password.
So it's a default password.
Right, right. I can't even tell you. Somebody bought Metasploit. Does anybody know what Metasploit is? All right, it's a piece of software that helps monitor your system. It comes with a user ID name known as admin and a password known as admin. I can't even tell you how many times I go in and I see that. Imagine, this is the tool that's going to use to let you know if somebody's inside your system. That means anybody can get in and erase all of your logs so that you can't ever see what's going on. Yeah, so that's what a vendor default is. 3.0 has a new requirement. It did not exist under 2. And that is, Michael, protect point-of-sale devices from tampering and substitution. So now what you have to do, and this probably applies to all of you, how many of y'all have a Veraphone that you take a swipe on? Yeah, or Genoco, or whatever it is. So now, today, underneath 3.0, you have to maintain an updated list of a point-of-sale device. You need to have a list that says, here's the device, here's the model number, here's the serial number, all right? And then you need to periodically inspect. You have to have a policy that tells you when that is, but you need to go around and look and say, yep, same model, serial number, same, oh, no, this one's different. Now you've got, somebody swapped it out. So you've got to be able to periodically inspect, and you need to make sure that when you do that inspection, you document that you did it, because this is all about being able to prove in a case of law that you did what you're supposed to do. And then you have to provide training to your personnel to be aware of attempted tampering or replacement. Do they even know? Does your frontline person even know what it looks like if somebody's tampering with the equipment? So that has all been added, and now you have to have policies and procedures around that. Next one. In 2.0, number 10 is all about logging. Review all system components at least daily. They said, oh no, let's get real specific here. So in 3.0, you now have to review at least daily all security events. Logs from systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data and or sensitive authentication data, or that could impact the security of the cardholder data or the sensitive authentication data. Logs of all critical system components, logs of all servers and system components that perform security functions. And then we have another requirement. Review the logs of all other system components periodically based upon the organization's policies, risk management system, and determined by the organization's annual risk assessment. Changed penetration testing from 2.0. In 2.0, you had to perform internal and external penetration testing at least once a year after significant change. Now, you have to put in place a methodology for penetration testing. You have to have a vulnerability management system where you have to go through and determine what you are running a penetration test on, why are you doing it. So you have to have a methodology around what you are doing. And it's not just once a year, but it's really dependent upon what your methodology is. Obviously, a small organization is going to be much, much different than a health center. All right, so at a glance, let's look at what else is new. Do you have any questions so far? And these are the requirement numbers, but what else is new is that you used to have to have a network diagram. Now, you have to have a network diagram, and you have to have a data flow chart. I'm going to show you one of those in just a minute. You have to maintain an inventory of all system components, not just the point-of-sale devices, but all system components. I'm going to show you what that needs to look like. You need to evaluate evolving malware threats for systems not commonly affected by malware. People used to say, oh, I have a UNIVAC system. It doesn't get affected by anything that has to do with malware. Well, you know what? You need to prove it. You now need to prove that somebody can't get in there. Number 8, requirement 8 says reorganize to provide a more holistic approach to authentication. They had just a ton of stuff about how you access, password links, so forth and so on. So they've done a better job of organizing that. Number 9 has to do with physical security. Physical access to sensitive areas must be authorized and terminated when no longer needed. So if a sensitive area is a place that has stored cardholder data, it could be that closet over there that has all the paper in it. It could be a data center room. It could be where the voice recordings are. So you need to make sure that for somebody to go there, they have to be authorized. They can't just be in there because they just walk through on their way to work every day. No, you've got to make sure that it's locked down tight. And then requirement 12, risk assessments, not just annually, but after any significant change to your environment. If you decide that you're going to replace your application with another application, you've got to do a security risk assessment on that after you install that. And then a big overview now is that assign security responsibilities to maintain segregation of duties. You can't have fox in a hen house anymore. Segregation of duties, not just from a production environment, but segregation of duties from who is taking the inventory of those point-of-sale devices, and then who's going back to verify they haven't been changed out. Those have to be 2 separate people. You got to think like the bad guy. So if you want to know where segregation of duties is, where can somebody do a bad thing? Then that's when you decide to separate and have one person do one thing, one person do another. And I have healthcare people tell me, I don't know how to think like the bad person. Yeah, you can. You just watch a few bad movies and it'll come to you. All right, so here we go, 12A. Information about responsibilities. So they put more information in there about what your responsibilities are. All right, now we talk about future dates. These are the ones that have a July 1 date. And they are, and these are mostly for IT people. So coding practices include consideration of handling the PAN and the SAD in memory. So if you are doing your own programming, or you've got programmers doing this, or you're writing a website and you're putting that off on somebody, there's special coding practices they need to be doing. The next one, coding practices to protect against broken authentication and session management. Once again, another IT phrase, but at the end of the day, you don't allow anybody to write code for you that could impact the security of cardholder data unless they are doing this proper coding. 8, service providers are to use unique authentication credentials for each customer. What we found is that service providers, the guy who takes care of your system, there's a restaurant, there's 5 restaurants in Louisiana, and they all hired this one IT guy who's really, really cool. And you know what? He used the same password and ID for every one of his customers. So he had a bad employee who logged in and captured cardholder data from every one of those little restaurants in Louisiana. And when they came back and they said, but we didn't do it. It was this guy. They went, you're responsible, just like HIPAA, you're responsible for your service provider. I'm finding all of you restaurants. You figure out how to go after him. Well, the guy didn't have deep pockets, so they couldn't go after him, but they were fine. What does it mean they were fine? It means that every time a swipe was taken in their restaurant, Visa kept the money until they got their fines paid. That's what that meant. 9.9, protect point-of-sale terminals and devices from tampering. That has a future. That doesn't have a future date, but it's real important for you to understand that that right there is so critical, and you need to focus on that one. 11.3, develop and implement a methodology for pen testing. That's by July 1. 12.9, and this is only for service provider, and that means that your hosting provider, or whoever it is that you have allowed to have access, they need to tell you which controls that they are going to be responsible for. They can't just say, yeah, we're compliant. No. What are you compliant in? What are you compliant with? So by July 1, they have to give you a list of all of those.
So Suzanne, going back to 8.5.1, how would you expect the merchant to enforce that?
Going back to 8.5.1?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, for them to get inside your systems, okay, you should know the access controls for that. You should be giving that to them.
Mhm.
But if they set your system up, they may say, well, we already have our login to get inside your system. Print out the access control list and go, wait a minute. This is ABC company, so it's ABC is the name and password? No. Who's going to get in? If it's John Smith, then you need to make sure you see John Smith's name or something like that. And then from a legal standpoint, I'd have them sign something that they're doing that. Yeah. But once again, and I would say, how deep are their pockets? If they don't have deep pockets, don't hire them. Because a lot of things are coming from service providers, and it's a contract that you have with them. So you need to make sure that if something happens, you can get your money back. Because the council, the council doesn't have the ability to do anything about finding you, but they are telling you the requirement. And these are the things that you need to have in place. You need to prove that if you can prove you're doing it, and it was a bad person, that's another story. Okay?
Are you all seeing any chatter in the insurance industry about cyber liability coverage exclusions for an insured's failure to comply with PCI DSS?
Yeah, they'll put all kinds of exclusions if it's you failed to do what you were supposed to do.
I mean, how recent? See, I work for Hanford.
Yeah.
And
we
we
okay.
blew through our cyber liability coverage in about
Yeah, I
30
mean,
minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My experience, they're fairly expensive policies to get. They're going to have a number of exclusions within them. I mean, they're good things to have because typically what you see now is vendors. In my former life, I tried to negotiate with all our vendors. If they were handling credit card information, I would insert a clause in the contract that said they are familiar with and they comply with all relevant PCI data security standards, and they would indemnify us if they failed to do so, and they would have unlimited liability for that. Vendors are typically pushing back now, and so your gap is to go out and get cyber liability insurance coverage to account for that gap and the risk. The problem is, like you said, you're typically going to get exclusions if you fail to do certain steps on your end to protect the data.
Well, because when our breach happened in 07, 08, that was before the maturity of all of this, and the cyber liability coverage was pennies on the dollar. So it was really cheap, and there weren't exclusions. And we're pretty good, I think, about requiring vendors to have cyber liability coverage. But there's the obligation may not be worth the paper that it's written on.
Do you typically require your vendor to give you
Pretty
copies?
often.
Yeah.
We have that. I mean, we have 8,000 contracts pending at any given time.
So you may not just be able to audit to see whether they all have certificates.
We
of
have that. We
insurance.
have the right,
Yeah.
for them to give it to us. But that's not an issue. I've kind of followed the cyber liability trend the last 3 or 4 years, and that's not been something I've seen a lot of. With the technicality of the version 3.0, if I was Lloyd's or a non-admitted carrier,
Yeah.
I would certainly be having riders on or exclusions for
Yeah.
non-compliance.
Well, and I'm seeing a lot of it out there now that it's I would say probably the last 6 months, it's really picked up. My clients who I've suggested they get it, they're like, I don't understand why. And they don't, but now they do, because Target really had a major impact. Target had lots of insurance to cover what you have to pay for, which is making those cards and
Yeah.
data breach notification. I mean, that's just huge right there. And their insurance didn't cover all that.
Excuse me, Pat Woodcock, she, took a call out here. Oh, okay, thank you.
So we're starting to see that just to pay for, has nothing to do with fraud, just to pay for the cost that you have to incur immediately, just a forensic team coming out there, to be able to do that. So that cyber insurance covers those costs on the front end. How many of you fill out an SAQ every year? Okay. There are 326 controls you have to have in place, and you just saw a few of them, so you can understand the minutia, the detail you have to do to comply with it. It's extensive. So what the council did in cooperation with the brands was to say, okay, here's all of these, but some companies, the way they process reduces the scope of what they have to do. So what they've done is that they have said, all right, obviously if you're a level 1, which means you process greater than 6 million transactions a year, you have to hire a QSA to come in and do the audit. You can hire a QSA to come in and do an assessment at any particular time. However, if you want to do your own, then what you can do is take a look at how you process and then choose which self-assessment questionnaire you can use. Version 3 has added more because there's more different ways to process credit card. This is what you attest that you are compliant. You are to do this every year. If you haven't done it, then you haven't done it. So if you had a breach last year and they find it out this year and they come to you and you haven't done it, then you're called not compliant, and then that's when all the fees and fines start. So the SAQs, there are now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 types of SAQs. So I want to start with just the very first ones and show you what they are, and you can of course go and look at these. But type A, card not present, that means you never see the customer. Card not present, all payment processing functions fully outsourced, no electronic card holder data. In other words, you get everything maybe from a website and somebody has done all that for you and you never see anything. That is called SAQ type A, and of the 326, there's only 14 you have to comply with. My next column is in version 2, how many were there, and do you have to have a scan and do you have to have a pen test? So you can use this chart to see where you fit. For example, if you have, the only thing you do with a credit card is that you have this Veraphone, this terminal that is connected to your internet, not telephone line, but to the internet. That's now called B-IP.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Is Pat back in here? I'll go find her. I just read her work is calling her.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
BIP is what that's called. The merchant has merchants have a standalone IP connected payment terminal, no e-commerce, no electric card holder data storage, 83 controls. 83 controls because you're connected to an internet. 83 controls. So this is good for you to go through and to look and to see, and it'll help you determine where you fit. Any questions over this?
Suzanne, it's just after 9 o'clock.
Okay, I'm just about done. The SAQs now have 4 columns over there. Rather than yes and no, 4 columns over there. What do those 4 columns mean? Yes means you've done the testing. Yes with CWC means you have a compensating control. All right, so it's important for you to look at those and make sure that if it says yes with testing, you've tested it and you've got the documentation to support you've tested. You just check the box. So here's some examples of what's happened in version 3. Here's what a cardholder data flow diagram looks like. That's what one looks like. When I say you need to keep information of the cardholder data, you need for authorization, capture, settlement, and chargeback, the types of cardholder data, and the description of that. This comes straight from the PCI Council. I did not make this up. This comes straight from the Council. These are the types of things you need to have filled out. Description of all networks that store and process cardholder data. Description of all networks that do not store cardholder data. Description of all networks confirmed to be out of scope. Yes. Next one, wireless technology. Where is it? All these charts I'm giving you come straight from the PCI Council as to what you need to do in 3.0. Critical hardware in use. Identify and list all the hardware, the type of device, the vendor, make and model, the role and functionality of that. Next one, critical software. The name of the software product, the version, the role. Next one, if you're doing sample sets, where'd your sample sets come from? Service providers, who are they? What data do you share with them, and what's the purpose of sharing that data, and what's the status of their compliance? Next one, third-party payment application solution. What's the name of it? What's the version? Is it compliant? Is it point-to-point encryption compliant? And what's the reference number on the Council for that one? And when does that certification expire? Yes, ma'am.
Sampling, is there a PCI DSS approved sampling methodology?
Let me tell you what we use,
Okay.
okay? And we use this because if anybody knows anything about statistics, you know that if you have 400 things, to be statistically significant, you probably need to sample 385, okay? So instead of using random sampling, what we use is the BITS methodology. The BITS methodology is that if you have less than 3, you sample all.
Yeah.
And then you sample 10% up to 30. So if you have 1,000 routers, you only do 30.
Yeah.
But if you got one that's out of place, you now do 30 more, and 30 more.
So
that's
sort of
what
a
BITS-
SOX,
Yeah.
a SOX version of your sampling.
Yeah,
Okay,
right. This is the PCI Security Standards website. Any questions that you have, they got FAQs on here. If you want to know which software is compliant, it's on here. If you want to know which devices are compliant, model numbers, it's on here. If you want to know if a company has QSAs, if they're for real, there's where you go. You want to know where your ASVs are, here's where you go. This is the site. And it also gives you the data security standards for you to download. It also gives you the SAQs. Anything you want is on this site. Okay? Any questions? That's a lot of stuff in a short period of time. Yes, ma'am.
We're a medical practice. We have one terminal. We never see the patients. They call in their credit card number. We write it down. We have an Excel spreadsheet. We put it in to make sure we balance at the end of the month. End of the month, we cross through their credit card number. We scan those into our stuff where we keep all our stuff. What do we need to change?
What do you scan?
We scan the sheet where we've written down the number,
Okay.
but we've blocked out their number.
All right, so let's start with number 1.
Mhm.
Do you electronically store cardholder data?
Yes.
Okay. If you tell me that you cross out
Two
out,
different, we do it 2 different methods though.
Okay.
We after they post the payment, at the end of the month, we, block out.
so you have an
the-
Excel spreadsheet you keep for the
Two
month?
different, well, we have an ongoing Excel spreadsheet that we give to our accountant at the end of the month for her to balance to the payment coming in, but it's got all the information on it.
All the full credit card
Plus,
numbers?
there's yes, and that's not blanked out. Then we have, when the patient comes in, or when they call in, we have this piece of paper that we use to post at the end of the month. That's when we cross that out. So 2 different things.
Okay, so this all has to do with process,
Mhm.
people and technology.
Mhm.
Process. You made a choice to have a process that stores cardholder data. It's called an Excel spreadsheet. Because you are storing cardholder data, all the 326 controls apply to you.
Okay.
Now, if you don't store cardholder data, then now we go back and I say, okay, the way you process is with this machine.
Mhm.
That's it. Then now, that machine, is it telephone or is it connected to the internet?
Do you have a little swiping machine
Yeah,
that has a
little
phone
swipe
line?
machine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it connected to the telephone line or is it connected to the,
It's connected to the phone line.
it's connected to the phone line. It's connected to the phone line, that makes it B, which makes you 41 controls out of 341. All right, so that's the one you would do. You need to change your process. Why are you storing a full credit card number on an Excel spreadsheet? It's probably because somebody told you to. Reality is you don't need that. The most you can have to not have cardholder data is the first 6 and last 4. If, when you typed it in, you typed in the first 6 and go ... and the last 4, you can do that.
Okay.
All right. Once you have submitted that credit card, pretty much your processor will only give you back the last 4. All right. So you've made a choice to increase your scope of compliance, and it's going to cost you a heck of a lot of money every year to do 300 some odd controls. So the first thing you need to do is to stop putting credit card data in that Excel spreadsheet.
Okay.
And then now, all those Excel spreadsheets don't contain cardholder data, so that piece doesn't have to comply with PCI anymore. All right.
The other problem you're going to have too is under North Carolina law, for instance, if you retain that data in an unencrypted form and somebody ever gets access to it, you have a data breach, you have to do a notification under North Carolina law.
Right. And also under PCI. So if that data was breached, and what does that mean? If somebody stole your server, somebody stole your server for whatever reason, what was on it? Excel spreadsheet. How far back? I don't know. I don't know. So you're telling me you've had that server for 8 years? It could be back 8 years? Yeah. So based upon your processor, he would say, over the 8 years, these are the people whose credit card numbers you have run, and those people have to be notified.
And that happens, but
That's a lot of people.
I don't know, in the news just a few months ago, Voodoo, which runs a movie service, they had a physical server stolen. They had unencrypted card data on it, and they had to put in credit monitoring in place for everybody whose card data was exposed.
Okay, so what do I do about the past, because I can go
The
forward.
past you can clean up. There's software you can get. I'm going to give you the name of it. It's called Card Recon. The name of the company is called Ground Labs. And per IP address, let's just say it's on one server. But if you guys are emailing it all over the place, you've got a lot of
No,
things.
we're not emailing
Okay.
it all over the place, it's just internally. in the
Just
office.
resident there.
Yeah.
So wherever this Excel spreadsheet or Excel spreadsheets with cardholder data have resided, you need to run Card Recon on those, and it will tell you exactly where it found cardholder data, the subdirectory, so forth and so on, and you need to, with management's approval, always get management's approval, you need to delete, and actually you need to swipe that, but that's a whole other story. But you need to swipe that data, and now it's no longer there.
And there are third-party services that you can use that will avoid you ever having to directly store the information yourself that are relatively inexpensive. And a number of my clients do that so they can avoid some of the storage requirements.
Right. But the fact that you've internally decided to use Excel spreadsheets, that was an internal decision. So, and that can be easily fixed because you don't need to store. Now, if you were to say to me, well, we do it on paper, well, that's a whole other story. That's a whole other story. On
Well,
paper,
We do it on paper too.
and now that you got the paper, where is it? You've got to have an inventory of what's on paper, okay? And it could be as simple as credit cards run January, February, March, April. Because remember, if you can't state whose data was breached, everybody gets notified. And it's $214, pretty much the average cost per person of a breach. So you've got to try to reduce it. That paper needs to be locked up. That paper, sensitive areas, who is authorized to have access to it? So whoever is authorized to have access to that are the only ones that can get into it. You can't just have it in some room somewhere in a file drawer. You've got to be able to wrap your arms around it. That's requirement number 9. Read requirement number 9, and it'll tell you everything you have to do about paper cardholder data. All right, and if you're going to redact it, which means you're going to take that full credit card number and do something to it so you can only read the first 6 or last 4, don't go get a Sharpie. There is truly a stamp, which is a whole lot easier than this. There's a stamp that you do this. It kind of looks like a barcode going on top of it. And you can't read it. But if you do a Sharpie, if I hold it up in the light and I can read it, you have not redacted that data. You okay? She looks like she's not going to go back to work.
Well, and Kathy, we can facilitate,
All right.
further questions,
Yeah.
for the-
Just think about what can I do to not have credit card data stored electronically? What can I do if it's on paper? What can I do on paper to remove the cardholder data? And once again, you've got to have everybody involved to make sure that you're not redacting data that somebody's requiring you to keep. So that's something else. You should have a data retention policy that lets you know how long you should be able to keep this certain type of data. All right. It's very expensive. It's very, very expensive, but the first time that you go through it, then after that it becomes business as usual. We have a client known as Community Health Systems on the PCI side, not the HIPAA side, in case you knew that they had a breach. It took us 2 years to clean up all their cardholder data, 2 years. So this is not something you're gonna be able to go back this afternoon. If you plan out how you're going to do it and get a project plan and check it off and put it in a timely fashion such as you can meet your deadline, you can have this done and cleaned up. But you're no different than a lot of the healthcare organizations that we see. You're no different.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because your job has always been to take care of the patients. So,
It's pretty common.
any questions? Any answers? All right, I'm done.
Great, thank you, Dr. Miller, and thank you everyone for coming. I just want to also let you know that on October 30th, we have our final seminar in the series called IT and the Cloud, so you'll be getting further information about that as well. So thank you again for coming. It's great to see everyone.
Thank you.